The brutal arithmetic of the frontier rarely allowed for a second chance, and it never, under any circumstances, accepted an excuse. On September 17, 1876, the air in Helena, Montana Territory already carried the sharp, metallic scent of coming snow. Margaret Lindström stood in the freezing dirt outside a small log cabin, staring at the closed timber door of the man who had just condemned her to a highly probable death. Her husband had been in his grave for exactly 3 weeks. Her brother-in-law, a man named Eric, who viewed familial duty as a ledger of inconveniences, had given her until sundown to clear off his property. With 6 hours of daylight remaining, the sky above the Elkhorn Mountains was turning the color of bruised iron. The almanac for that year predicted the coldest winter in a decade, a forecast that would soon prove horrifyingly accurate. The temperature was destined to plummet to 20 degrees below zero within a matter of weeks. Margaret was 41 years old. She spoke English with a heavy, rolling Swedish accent that made the local merchants impatient, and she owned precisely nothing in the world except what she held in her raw, calloused hands. Her inventory of survival consisted of 2 empty flour sacks, a heavy steel splitting maul, and exactly $7 in silver and copper coins. In 1876, $7 was a fraction of what was required to survive a Montana winter. No boarding house in the territory would take in a destitute widow without references or a male guarantor. The nearest homestead that might offer domestic work as a temporary reprieve sat 43 miles east across unforgiving terrain, and she possessed no horse. But Margaret carried an invisible asset that Eric and the rest of the Helena settlement had profoundly underestimated. She had spent the first 12 years of her life in the deep, dark forests of Dalarna, Sweden. Her father had been a charcoal burner, a man who understood that physics is the only judge that matters when the world turns hostile. She knew how wood burned, how heat traveled, and how to stay alive when the environment actively wanted you dead. Shelter, surprisingly, was not her immediate primary concern. She knew she could carve a dugout into the stable clay of a hillside in 2 days if the earth yielded properly. The true, terrifying problem was fuel. A Montana winter required a minimum of 4 full cords of split hardwood or densely packed pine just to keep a single woman from freezing in a 12 by 12 foot subterranean space. But possessing the wood was only half the equation. That firewood absolutely had to remain bone dry. If wood absorbs moisture from autumn rains or drifting snow, its thermodynamic properties change violently. Wet wood does not burn. It smolders. The latent heat of vaporization forces the fire to expend its BTUs, boiling the water out of the log rather than radiating heat into the room. It produces thick, blinding smoke instead of thermal energy. In a confined dugout, severe smoke accumulation meant waking up dead from carbon monoxide poisoning, a quiet, suffocating tragedy she had witnessed claim an entire Norwegian family 2 years prior in 1874. The conventional, acceptable solution in the territory was a separate, freestanding woodshed, a standard 8 by 12 foot structure built with milled dimensional lumber, a pitched tin roof, and a raised wooden floor, cost between $30 and $40 in materials alone. Margaret had $7. She had 47 days before the first killing freeze locked the earth solid, assuming the weather held, which it rarely did. She did not weep. She did not beg at Eric's door. She gripped the handle of her splitting maul, turned her back on the settlement, and walked south along Prickly Pear Creek. She walked until the canyon walls tightened, and the north-facing slope became steep enough to guarantee that winter snows would drift 8 feet deep. She was looking for specific geological geometry. She found it in an old rock slide that had carved a natural, semicircular alcove into the hillside, roughly 11 feet across, and cut 6 feet deep into the stone. The exposed rock curved inward like the hollowed interior of a massive wooden barrel. Her father's lessons whispered in her memory. Stone is the ultimate thermal battery. If she could somehow enclose the front of this alcove without spending money she did not possess, the hillside itself would act as a structural shield, shedding the crushing weight of snow and deflecting the bitter winds. The stone back wall would absorb the ambient heat of any small fire and release it slowly through thermal lag, preventing the wood from freezing solid. Furthermore, its elevation on the slope placed it safely above the devastating floodplain that turned Prickly Pear Creek into a violent torrent during the inevitable spring thaw. 4 men, rugged laborers, from the Helena Lumber Company staging area 200 yards downstream, stopped their work to watch her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, a heavy, silent skepticism that hung in the cold mountain air. They saw a desperate, destitute widow standing before a pile of rocks. Margaret saw a thermodynamic fortress. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, and who understands that traditional engineering often holds the key to surviving impossible odds, subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques. Also, comment below, which city are you watching from? By noon, Margaret had cleared the heavy brush from the alcove's entrance and initiated the true labor. The creek bottom was choked with young, aggressive cottonwood and willow saplings. None of them exceeded 4 inches in diameter, but they possessed a crucial mechanical property. They were entirely green, saturated with living sap, which allowed them to bend under extreme tension without snapping. Using a heavily worn bucksaw she had managed to borrow and promised to return by sunset, she harvested 12 saplings, each approximately 14 feet in length and as thick as a strong man's wrist. The fundamental rule of structural timber her father had beaten into her understanding was simple. Green wood bends, dead wood breaks. The curve you force into living timber today, while the cellulose fibers are pliable, becomes permanent and rigid tomorrow as the wood cures in place. She drove 2 heavy wooden stakes deep into the frozen dirt, at the extreme edges of the alcove's opening, exactly 11 feet apart. Taking the first 14-foot sapling, she buried its left end 18 inches deep into the soil. Using her entire body weight, she bent the thick sapling overhead in a violent, groaning arc, wrestling the right end down and anchoring it securely into the earth. The sapling locked into a perfect, tension-loaded semicircle, mimicking the wooden rib cage of a Conestoga wagon. She repeated this grueling process 11 more times, spacing each arch meticulously 16 inches apart on center, until a skeletal tunnel emerged from the hillside. At 2 South p.m., the first skeptic arrived. Thomas Brennan, the seasoned foreman of the Northern Pacific Survey crew, who had recently taken a mining claim near Marysville, possessed a keen eye for structural failure and zero tolerance for frontier foolishness. He was a man who understood load-bearing walls and iron nails. "Mrs. Lindström," Brennan said, pulling off his heavy wool hat and exhaling a cloud of white vapor. "That's an interesting notion you're building." "It's a woodshed, Mr. Brennan," Margaret replied, not stopping her work. "A woodshed?" Brennan's eyes dragged over the skeletal arches, which were already seizing into their curved geometry. There were no vertical studs, no horizontal top plates, no milled flooring. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but you've got maybe 6 weeks before snow that'll bury this canyon. You planning to live through winter in a hole with a fence made of sticks?" "I'm planning to keep 4 cords of firewood dry," she stated flatly. "The living part happens elsewhere." Brennan shook his head, looking at the sheer face of the mountain rising above her claim. "Cottonwood and willow won't hold snow load. First storm will flatten whatever you're building here. Snow is going to hit the hillside 20 feet above this spot and slide right over." "I'm not building tall enough to catch it," Margaret fired back, her understanding of aerodynamic load distribution far exceeding his. Brennan did not look convinced. He replaced his hat and walked away, certain he was watching a woman orchestrate her own frozen demise. As the sun sank, dropping the temperature rapidly, Margaret began the weaving. She had separated the longest, most intensely flexible willow shoots, hundreds of them, slender as pencils and 8 feet long. Starting at the absolute ground level, she wove these shoots horizontally through the vertical, arched saplings, over, under, over, under. She pulled each green strand brutally tight before feeding the next. She was engaging in wattle and daub construction, executing basket making on a massive architectural scale. By dusk, her raw hands had completed 3 vertical feet of woven lattice wall that curved seamlessly from the rock face, slowly swallowing the opening. The weave was a marvel of vapor control, tight enough to shatter the velocity of incoming winter winds, but porous enough to allow trapped internal moisture to escape, preventing the firewood from rotting. She returned the bucksaw and spent her first night shivering beneath a canvas tarp strung between 2 pines, listening to the predatory arguments of coyotes echoing in the Black Canyon. The morning of September 18th brought a killing frost that blackened the remaining summer wildflowers. Margaret ignored the cold, weaving willow shoots until the rough bark wore through her calluses and her fingers bled freely onto the pale wood. By midday, the wall was 5 feet high. The structure no longer looked like sticks. It resembled the inverted hull of a Norse longboat, half buried in the mountain. Miners stopped to mock her, but Samuel Chen did not. Chen had emigrated from Guangdong Province in 1869, laying iron for the Transcontinental Railroad, before establishing a freighting business in the brutal mountain camps. He had seen humanity survive across 2 distinct continents. "This design," Chen said, his English precise and careful, "reminds me of structures in northern China, earth and wood together." "I'm Swedish," Margaret noted, "but the principle is probably the same. Work with what you've got." "The curve is smart," Chen observed, his eyes tracing the load paths. "Distributes weight, but those willow shoots? They'll dry out and shrink. Gaps will open." Margaret nodded. "Not if I seal them right." "With what?" "Tar paper costs money. Canvas costs money." "Clay's free," she said. "And there's a deposit 200 yards upstream that's got enough structure to hold." Chen's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "You're going to do it like a wattle and daub wall." "If the clay doesn't crack when it freezes," Chen warned, "mix it with enough grass and manure, it won't crack," Margaret replied, outlining the exact physics of ancient composite materials. "Mongols have been doing it for 1,000 years. Swedes figured it out about 500 years ago. I'm just late to the party." For the next 4 days, Margaret became a human mortar mixer. She waded into the freezing creek to harvest dense gray clay. She dragged dried prairie grass and hauled heavy free loads of horse manure from a nearby livery stable. She combined these elements with precise amounts of water to create a thick, highly fibrous paste. The cellulose in the grass acted like modern rebar, while the enzymes and fibers in the manure provided elasticity, preventing the clay from shrinking and shattering during the freeze-thaw cycle. She violently packed this heavy mixture into every single gap in the willow lattice, building up the interior and exterior layers until the monolithic wall was an impenetrable 3 inches thick. Her shoulders screamed in agony, but the structure was now waterproof, windproof, and possessed immense thermal mass. The roof required a different kind of genius. She could not afford milled cedar shakes or tin. Instead, she looked to the ridge above, to the ancient ponderosa pines. Ponderosa bark grows in massive, thick, plate-like structures. Over 2 exhausting days, she climbed the rough trunks, her hands completely blackened and sticky with natural pitch, prying off 73 massive bark slabs, each 2 feet long and 14 inches wide. She overlapped these biological shingles across the dome of her structure, pinning them directly into the willow framework with sharpened wooden pegs. The bark plates perfectly followed the aerodynamic curve. It was during the final waterproofing of this roof, using a heated, foul-smelling mixture of pine pitch and rendered animal fat, that the ultimate societal skeptic arrived. Father Heinrich Müller, a rigid Lutheran minister who had immigrated from Bavaria in 1868, represented the heavy, moralizing authority of the settlement. "Mrs. Lindström," Father Müller announced, watching her smear boiling fat across the bark, "the congregation has discussed your situation. We can offer you domestic work in exchange for a room in the church basement through winter." Margaret did not pause her work. "That's kind of you, Father. What sort of domestic work? Cleaning, laundering, meal preparation for church functions, standard arrangements? How many hours? Perhaps 30, possibly 35, depending on need. And the room is 8 by 10, shared facilities. Adequate heat." Margaret slowly descended her improvised pine branch ladder. She wiped the black pitch from her bleeding hands and locked eyes with the minister. "Father Müller, I appreciate the offer, but I'm 41 years old. I've buried a husband and 2 children, and I've worked every day of my life since I was 7. I'm not interested in becoming a servant in a church basement." The minister stiffened. "Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindström." "So is wasting what God gave you," she countered sharply. "He gave me 2 hands and a brain. I'm using both." Muller's face darkened with righteous anger. "This structure you're building, it's inappropriate, unseemly, for a Christian woman to be living in a hole in the ground like an animal." "I'm not planning to live in it," Margaret clarified. "I'm building a woodshed. My dugout's 20 feet east." She had not yet dug the residential dugout, but physics doesn't care about technicalities. "This will fail," Muller pronounced with grim certainty. "When it does, the church's offer may not stand." "Then I guess I'd better not fail," Margaret said, turning back to her roof. By September 28th, her financial ledger was a testament to extreme poverty and maximum efficiency. She had spent exactly $5 of her $7. A box of heavy 90-penny nails cost $0.60. A pound of rendered tallow cost $0.40. 2 yards of coarse burlap to cover the entrance cost $0.30. She had bartered her dead husband's pocket watch for a heavily damaged 3-legged sheet metal stove, which she propped up with flat river stones. Her total material cost for a highly engineered, aerodynamically superior, thermally stable structure was an astonishing $6.20. The remaining $2 bought just enough dried beans and cornmeal to keep her heart beating through October. The basket was complete. It enclosed roughly 66 square feet of highly protected interior space. Now she had to fill it. For 3 agonizing days, Margaret wielded her steel maul against dead, standing lodgepole pines. Lodgepole pine, if seasoned perfectly, burns with intense, clean heat. She worked from the gray light of dawn until the absolute dark, driving the wedge through massive rounds until the blisters on her palms tore open, bled down the wooden handle, and finally calloused into thick, protective armor. She hauled the heavy splits to her woven dome, stacking them with mathematical precision. Massive, stable logs forming the base, smaller splits cross-hatched above to guarantee capillary airflow, and everything pitched at a slight angle to ensure any rogue moisture would drain instantly outward. By October 1st, she had 3.5 full cords packed tight to the arched ceiling. Nature delivered its first violent stress test on October 3rd. It wasn't snow, but a merciless, freezing rain that fell uninterrupted for 36 hours, turning Prickly Pear Creek into a churning, violent brown disaster. The ambient temperature hovered at a lethal 34 degrees. Winds slammed through the canyon at 40 miles per hour. Margaret huddled under a tarp in the muddy pit of her unfinished residential dugout, watching the storm assault her woodshed. The physics held perfectly. The heavy water struck the bark shingles and was instantly channeled down the steep, aerodynamic curves. Not a single drop of water penetrated the 3-inch daubed walls. When the sky finally cleared, she peeled back the frozen burlap door and touched her firewood. Bone dry. The moisture content remained at an optimal 14%. No dampness, no mold. Thomas Brennan, the foreman who had mocked her stick fence, returned that afternoon. He stared at the dry wood, then at the impenetrable walls. "Mrs. Lindström," Brennan said, his voice stripped of all prior arrogance, "I owe you an apology for assuming you didn't know what you were doing." "For what, Mr. Brennan?" Margaret asked, shoveling heavy dirt. "I inspected it after the storm. That's solid work. Better than solid? That's smart work." He swallowed his pride. "I spent $38 on my woodshed last year. Milled lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Yours is better. But a rainstorm is merely an inconvenience on the frontier." The true executioner arrived on November 12, 1876. The temperature collapsed to an instantaneous 8 degrees below zero overnight. 6 inches of fine, dry snow fell, followed immediately by another 8, and then another 12. Totaling 26 inches of accumulation, the storm was driven by a horrific, screaming wind descending from the Continental Divide at 60 miles per hour. It was a whiteout blizzard that buried fence lines, obliterated the Helena Road, and trapped every living soul in their shelters for 3 consecutive days. This was the weather that killed the unprepared. Conventional woodsheds with flat tin roofs groaned and collapsed under the immense, concentrated static load of the snow. Planks warped, and freezing wind forced snow through every microscopic gap in standard timber framing, burying people's essential fuel supplies in feet of dense ice. Margaret's dome did not fight the wind. It allowed the 60-mile-per-hour gusts to flow seamlessly over its curved surface. The heavy snow accumulation simply slid off the pitched bark shingles. Inside her residential dugout, the thermal mass of the earth maintained a steady, life-saving 48 degrees without a fire. When she needed to cook, she pulled perfectly dry, pristine lodgepole splits from her basket shed. Because the moisture content was near zero, the wood caught a spark instantly and burned with maximum BTU output, emitting zero smoke. While Margaret survived in thermodynamic comfort, a crisis unfolded in the settlement. On November 19th, a family of desperate Swedish immigrants, the Johanssons, stumbled into Helena. They had been defrauded by a land speculator and arrived with no money. Lars, the father, was dying of severe tuberculosis, coughing up blood, and rapidly losing lung capacity. His wife, Karen, was 6 months pregnant and starving. They had 3 children under the age of 8. True to his rigid worldview, Father Muller allowed them to shelter in the freezing church basement, but issued a strict ultimatum. They could not stay past Christmas. Able-bodied people were expected to provide for themselves, entirely ignoring the reality that Lars was actively dying and Karen was physically incapable of felling timber. They had no money, and therefore, they had no firewood. Without fuel, the children would freeze to death on the basement floor before the month ended. Margaret learned of their impending execution from Samuel Chen. She walked to the church and found Karen weeping in the dark, frigid basement. "How much firewood do you have?" Margaret asked the terrified mother. "Maybe 2 weeks' worth if we're careful." "Lars can't cut more," Karen sobbed. Margaret possessed a surplus of perfectly seasoned wood in her vault. But the brutal social dynamics of the frontier meant that accepting overt charity stripped a family of their final shred of dignity, breaking their psychological will to survive. Margaret engineered a lie to save their lives and their pride. "I need workers," Margaret told Karen with an authoritative tone. "I'm planning to build 2 more storage structures before spring. One for root vegetables and one for tools." The pay is firewood instead of cash. One day's work from the children equals a week's worth of splits. They stack, I cut. Does that sound fair? Karen's eyes filled with hot tears. She recognized the utter fiction of the proposal, but the mechanism allowed her to accept the grace without humiliation. That's more than fair, she whispered. For the next 6 weeks of the freezing winter, the 3 small Johansson children marched to Margaret's claim. Margaret fed them, taught them how to read the clouds, and handed them loads of premium bone-dry wood from her miraculous basket shed. Lars Johansson's lungs finally hemorrhaged and failed on January 8, 1877. It was a tragedy the frontier demanded, but he did not die shivering in the dark. He died in a deeply warm room, heated by clean-burning wood his own children had proudly earned, surrounded by the fierce, protective heat of community. A month later, Karen gave birth to a healthy, screaming baby girl in the dead of winter. She named the child Margaret. The spring thaw of 1877 washed away the snow, but it could not wash away the undeniable truth of what Margaret Lindström had achieved. The traditional, expensive, conventional sheds had failed. The $38 milled lumber structures had leaked, warped, and allowed vital fuel to freeze. Margaret's 620 composite dome of sticks and mud had fundamentally outperformed modern commercial architecture. She had not fought the environment. She had manipulated its physical laws. Her design used thermal mass to regulate humidity, utilized aerodynamic curves to defeat static snow load and wind shear, and employed composite materials to prevent freeze-thaw cracking. The historical record confirms her absolute vindication. On March 3, 1877, the Helena Weekly Herald published an article documenting ingenious frontier architecture. The paper specifically praised barrel-vaulted structures of woven willow and daubed clay that had proven remarkably effective in severe weather. Though the paper refused to name her, newspapers of the era rarely credited women for structural engineering. The settlement knew exactly who had built it. Margaret Lindström did not remain destitute. By the time the 1880 Montana Territory census was recorded, her name appeared listed as a property owner with an assessed land value of $180, a highly substantial fortune for an independent single woman on the frontier. Her listed occupation was not a servant nor a laundress. The census taker recorded her as a teacher of practical building techniques, Mrs. Krijtkurer des. She ultimately taught her survival architecture to 43 different families, trading her engineering knowledge for labor, cash, and resources. Modern structural engineers today utilize the exact same physical principles Margaret employed. Monolithic dome construction, fiber-reinforced concrete, and passive humidity control all trace their fundamental thermodynamic logic back to vernacular methods like wattle and daub. Margaret passed away in 1903 at the age of 68. She died wealthy, owning 320 acres of land, a massive home in Helena, and lucrative shares in 2 mining operations. The original 620 woven willow shed stood unyielding against the blizzards for 36 years, outlasting the critics, the skeptics, and the horrific winters. It was only destroyed in 1912 when a massive forest fire ripped through Prickly Pear Canyon, consuming everything in its path. The frontier is gone, but the brutal arithmetic of physics remains unchanged. The people who survive are not the ones who spend the most money fighting nature. They are the ones who observe the world, respect its forces, and have the courage to build solutions that make the arrogant laugh, right up until the storm hits. If you found value in this story, and if you see the undeniable genius in preserving the practical knowledge of the men and women who engineered their own survival against impossible odds, hit that like button to help others find these stories of creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge.